What the Flux? Master Liquid PL360 Flux? And PL240 Flux? I'm testing these on Alder Lake because Alder Lake's got some anomalous power usage, depending on if you're Team Red or Team Green GPU. But Cooler Master is actually launching some new coolers today, so I wanted to take a look at that first. Tower cooler or all-in-one? There's a lot of arguments to be made for tower cooler. There's no moving parts. It can't break. And that's a pretty good argument. But Alder Lake runs hot-ish, and it's kind of weird. Alder Lake is Intel's newest 12th generation CPUs, the 12900K, which is what I'm running in this system with the Cooler Master PL360 Flux, 360mm radiator. It's had very impressive performance for an AIO, rivaling that of some of the custom loops that I've built. It's very impressive. So I think Cooler Master sort of reworked things. The other thing to look for in an AIO is the warranty. 5 years. So I've only just started testing these because I'm doing a comparison between the power usage of a 6900 XT and the power usage of a 3090. And it's really hard to nail that down in a way that is makes sense. Igor's lab recently stumbled across this same thing, and they've done a lot more testing than I have with that so far. But it was something that I noticed in our initial Alder Lake reviews. There's something weird going on with the Alder Lake CPUs. A lot of people are saying, oh, it's 241 watts. And it is. But that's not really a lot different than the PL2 of the 11th gen. But what is different is when you're doing something like gaming, and the CPU doesn't have anything to do because it's waiting on the GPU, the 11th gen CPUs from Intel will use less power. It'll just, when there's nothing to do, they don't do anything. You save power. 12th gen doesn't seem to be that way. 12th gen seems to just keep right on going. And so that means that for boosts and thermals and things like that, your cooler has a lot more that it has to deal with. And so the performance characteristics are different. The die size, the shape of the silicon underneath the integrated heat spreader, is also a little different. And I'm sure that additional testing and other diagnostics will show that the heat spreader itself is much flatter. Intel really didn't have to pay a lot of attention to how convex or concave the heat spreaders are, and there's a lot of chip-to-chip variation. Well, they've thinned the die and done a lot of other mechanical things to make Alder Lake a little bit better thermally, because they had to, because 241 watts in physically a smaller area, when we're talking about your 8 performance cores using most of that power budget. We first saw something like this with the 5000 series AMD CPUs. So you get 2 chiplets and an I/O die. Now, the I/O die is not going to generate that much heat, but the chiplets are off-center to one side, and that's where your hotspots are. There's 8 cores in each chiplet, or 6 cores in the case of the 12 core, because it's 2 6-core chiplets. That's a lot of heat production in a relatively small area, and it's off-center, so not every single CPU cooler was designed with that in mind. These, from day one, designed for LGA 1700. Another anomalous thing that I've run into in doing my builds is the retro conversion kits for LGA 1700, depending on what all-in-one cooler it is. The mounting pressure is not super easy to get exactly right. I've seen temperature variations of like 7 degrees C, depending on what generation Asetek cooler you're using for your actual cooler. The mounting pressure, what order you tighten the screws down in, just remove it, repaste it, put it back together. So, if you roll a 1 thermal pasting your CPU, don't be afraid to pop it off there, clean the paste off, and repaste it and do it again if you feel like it's running hot, especially when you compare it to reviews like this one and say, my 12900K is actually running really hot compared to what I'm seeing in every other review, especially even before you overclock. Another thing that I will say is that, in general, overclocking with the 12900K is a little different than prior generations. I wouldn't try to actually overclock it in terms of clock speed out of the box. Like Ryzen, you just give it more power and let it do its thing. On Team Red, Precision Boost Overdrive, you just give it more power. Generally, it doesn't get super crashy. It can, depends on your CPU, and just let it do its thing. With the 12900K at 241 watts, okay, that's maybe the upper limit for that. You can run with, 241 watts, and that's fine. But the i7 is where that shines. The i7 and the i5 to a lesser extent, but the i7. Also, this is the only AIO 240 that I've tested that can keep up with the i5 and mostly the i7. depends what you're doing. If you're doing rendering, it's going to struggle a little bit more with the i7, but for the i5 it works really well. One of the things that I really like about the AIO versus a tower cooler is my RAM and the other stuff around the motherboard is accessible. Of course, that's also a little bit of a downside. Some newer higher end all-in-one coolers are actually coming with a downdraft fan on the pump. One, it helps cool the pump, which is good, but two, it gives you airflow around the VRM because the aforementioned 241 watts. Cooler Master, they don't have that on this fan, but they do have addressable RGB, which I've configured in our ASRock Tai Chi build. Now, I did a full video on this build if you want to check that out. Some of you already have high-end builds like this, and with different GPUs and other stuff, so I'm sort of curious for the community feedback. Is anybody else seeing this? Does anybody really care about power utilization and how this actually shakes out? Because on paper, it looks like Team Blue uses a lot more power, but the real world of it, especially when you're comparing to like an i7 versus an i9, the real world power utilization really isn't that much different. And it just seems like it's a misoptimization on the 12900K. When we're talking about gaming performance, the power, watts per frame, really, there's not a huge difference. It's a little weird to explain. It's a little weird to put that data set together. So I'm curious if that's, if it's within 20%, if that's really important. Because if you look at it on paper, it's like, wow, it looks like there's 100% difference in terms of power utilization. And worst case scenario, it's looking like it's on the order of 10%, 15% maybe. It just kind of depends on what you're doing. Now, rendering is much worse. But I'm talking about gaming performance with the very highest end GPUs you can get. The OC Formula 6900 XT, and of course our Founders Edition 3090. I'm still working on the data. You can join me in the forum if you have questions or anything like that. But I just wanted to share a quick update on something interesting, something anomalous. You can check out the Igor's Lab article. I think some other folks have sort of clued into this weird power anomaly. The other thing that's interesting is that the 6900 XT seems to cause the CPU to use less power, even though it's accomplishing the same amount of work. That varies from board to board, but the Tai Chi, I think, has been really well put together to work with the OC Formula 6900 XT. They're both ASRock, but the power utilization from say, ASRock to Asus to other boards, it varies more than I would think that it should, even accounting for differences in VRM design and heat production and looking at things with the FLIR camera. So I'm not really sure what to make of that either. Could be CPU, like CPU motherboard variance. It's like, okay, we set up this motherboard for 1 in 100 CPUs is like super terrible, so we're just going to assume that they're all terrible, and it doesn't really do a good job of figuring out how much power it actually needs. I don't know. And be on the lookout for more reviews of the Master Liquid PL240 Flux, like a more formal review. How much heat dissipation does it have? I just like the 5-year warranty. I mean, it's an AIO, they're going to stand by it, replace it, whatever. They've put the latest and greatest technology into it. Sickle flow fans, I like those fans. I don't care if they're RGB or not. It's good fans. I'm one of this level 1, I'm signing out. You can find me in the level 1 forum.